Hello, and welcome to the Empowered Learning Podcast. This is your host, Andy Bennett. On today's episode, we welcome Dr. Justin Baeder. Justin is a nationally known education leader, the director of the Principal Center and host of Principal Center Radio, a known and trusted voice on education reform on multiple social media platforms, the creator of the Instructional Leadership Challenge, a best-selling author, and just a great down-to-earth guy. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Hello, Justin. How are you doing today?
Doing well, Andy. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for giving me a few minutes of your time to meet with us on the Empowered Learning Podcast. I got lots of questions for you, and we don't know each other personally, but I reached out probably, about a month ago through one of your TikTok videos, and I'm like, hey, it's a long shot, but would you be interested in coming on my little fledgling video podcast? And you were very gracious to give us a minute of your time here, so I appreciate that.
Well, thanks. I'm honored and excited to be here.
You bet. You bet. So for those that don't know Justin, just give us a little bit of a background of kind of where you've gone, where you started, and then where you've gone educational wise and what you're working on now. And then we'll dive into a lot of the issues that you talk about on your podcast and your TikTok channel and in your foundation.
Sure thing. Yeah. So I'm an educational leadership author and consultant, and started my career as a middle school science teacher, became an elementary principal, and then in 2012 moved into the full-time world of consulting and writing books. And I have a software platform for teacher evaluation and things like that. And I'm pretty active on social media, on TikTok and Twitter and places like that. And as you mentioned, we got connected on TikTok.
Yeah. So what was the turning point for you to go from, being in education, making a difference in the kids' lives and your teachers' lives and this kind of stuff, to wanting to branch out and do something on your own on the consulting side? I mean, our stories are similar in some aspects of starting in education, being in education leadership, and then kind of branching off into a new world. So what was your path that kind of led you away from being in the classroom or in the schools to have a broader focus on education?
Yeah, the one word answer to that is the iPad. I became a principal around the time that the iPad was coming out, and was in that first wave of administrators using an iPad, and did a couple of webinars and workshops on how to use the iPad as an administrator.
Okay.
The NAESP conference happened by a coincidence to be in Seattle, which is where I was principal, twice in a row. So I got to present there and had just a huge response to those sessions. And as a follow-up, I started to do some things online, and that became a business. And I've gotten away from iPad, after a couple of years that, that ceased to be the main thing I did, and am more in the instructional leadership world now.
Okay. Gotcha. I love it. I love it. So it's interesting to me, and I haven't probably started from the very beginning because you got a lot of videos out there, but to your point, a lot of the new content is more on education reform, and we'll dive into a lot of kind of some of those hot button topics that I appreciate as a former educator, just your point of view on this, because I think that there's a lot of times that it seems like education is just, for lack of a better term, kind of going to hell in a handbasket. And it breaks my heart that the kids and the teachers are the ones that are suffering because of, lack of education reform, or just, poor leaders, or whatever the case is. So, but before we dive into that, because I'm sure that's where we'll spend most of our time. So you mentioned iPad. I'm as a tech guy, most of the new stuff that you're talking about is more on, not so much on the technology side. So I guess tell me a little bit about your technology side of things on education.
Yeah, as far as what I'm doing currently, I'm mostly in the software world. So we have an app for observing and writing teacher evaluations and doing any other type of writing that school leaders need to do.
Gotcha.
And that's about it on the tech side for me these days. So I really wanted to move more on to the into the instructional leadership domain.
So I guess maybe before we dive back into that, a better question, because that was not very well formed. I've always said that, rather than trying to limit technology, because that's almost a losing battle, especially with kids. So how would you leverage the benefits of technology education? Because there are benefits, but there are some harmful aspects. So how would you leverage benefits while minimizing some of the harmful aspects of technology in education?
Yeah, I think one of my rules of thumb for things like that is to look at what people do for their own kids. And anytime what people are doing for their own kids diverges from what they're advocating for other people's kids, to get. Like years ago, I heard that a lot of Silicon Valley executives were raising their kids almost without technology. No devices at a young age, things like that. I think we certainly do use technology with our own kids, but we're thoughtful about it. We're judicious about it. It's not everything is technology, and I certainly recognize the the downsides of that just for myself. Like sometimes I have to put my phone in the other room if I'm going to get read an article or write an article,
Right.
and I just think it's a matter of if we think of it as parents, often we will make better decisions for the students we serve as well.
Right. No, that's very good. And that's again, I might mention the word themes. There's a lot of themes as you watch some of your videos of things that matter to you. And I love that point of, rather than making decisions for education based on what makes the most sense for a policy or what would be, the path of least resistance, say, if this was my kid, what would I want to be done in this situation? And I agree with you. I think that would radically change how policymakers look at education and how they handle things. So,
yeah,
awesome.
Well said.
So lots of areas that we could dive into. So one of your newest videos kind of hit on 4 aspects of education that seems like you are very much involved in. And I'll start with a statement and then kind of get into a question here. So one of your latest videos basically said, education is getting away from the scientific approach to reform, and not your words, but more like the hopium, right? I mean, we hope this works, and we get on the bandwagon of, hey, this sounds like a great idea, let's jump in. And I've always talked about education kind of, and I think everybody probably does this too, but the idea of like a pendulum, right? We have these pendulum swings where everything is this or everything is that. It's like, well, most likely there's going to be some good things from both extremes, rather than changing everything that we've done in the past to this new latest craze. How about we do some scientific theory behind this before we, throw the baby out with the bathwater? So that was the gist of that. And you mentioned 4 things. So I guess let's kind of address each one of those, because again, if you go back and look at Justin's videos, a lot of them are on these 4 concepts. And the first one is discipline reform. So tell me some things that are going on in discipline reform that either need to change or a positive direction that you're seeing. So what are some areas in discipline reform that you are passionate about?
Yeah, I think when it comes to discipline reform, the initial impulse that drove what I think is now a pretty bizarre pendulum swing was a good impulse, right? We wanted to improve our numbers. We wanted to improve the disproportionality in our numbers, because we know that there are real human beings behind those numbers. And if we have inequities in our numbers, we naturally want to do something about that. The question for me has always been, what can we actually do about that changes things for the better for the human beings and not just the numbers? Because as I look at the different things that are being tried with discipline reform, they seem preoccupied with the numbers and almost willfully indifferent to the human consequences.
Right.
And, some of that is even in the study designs. There are published research studies that seem preoccupied with the statistics and not with the actual experience of students. So, the primary example that I think we're all familiar with is just the elimination of consequences, or the attempt to, as much as possible, eliminate consequences for especially unsafe and highly disruptive behavior. And, I would like to believe that it's as simple as that, but, it doesn't seem terribly plausible to me that we could fix bad behavior by removing the consequences for it. But I mean, that legitimately seems to be the theory that people are operating under, that if we simply take away the consequences, then students will feel better and then act better, and then we won't have any problems. And it was actually the consequences that were causing these problems all along. I mean, I don't know if I'm misrepresenting anybody in particular in characterizing it that way, but that seems to be the rationale. And I just don't think that holds up terribly well.
Right. No, I completely agree. And you also talked about, which I think kind of dives into the special education, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but this idea of 100% inclusion regardless of the situation. If people are unsafe, students are unsafe, teachers are unsafe. You've got a number of articles that you've quoted or kind of referred to in some of your videos of just the lack of teacher safety, and how among the hundreds of reasons why there's this mass exodus of teaching, that is definitely one of them. They don't feel valued. They don't feel safe. I mean, of course, why would I put myself in that situation over and over again when there's safety, or there's safety concerns for my own well-being, on top of the fact that I'm not getting paid well and I don't feel like I'm supported in making the differences in these kids. It's, I don't know, kind of a sad state of affairs.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say I'm a strong advocate of inclusion as a, as a default step, as a primary way that we serve students who have IEPs. And I certainly had many, many students in my school who received services under an inclusion model, and that was very successful for them.
Sure.
But at that time, and I was a principal in the, about 10, 15 years ago, and at that time, there was not the push that there is today for 100% inclusion. So we had self-contained programs, we had specialized programs, we had smaller classes with more adults and fewer students. And the existence of those programs, I'm realizing now in retrospect, is critical, right? We cannot do away with those programs and still meet the needs of every student. And even if someone believes that that is the case, special education law in the United States, IDEA, says that it is an IEP team decision to determine the least restrictive environment for each student. So this idea of having a district or a provincial or a state policy, I know the laws are different in Canada, and everywhere has their own laws, but in the United States, at least, it is illegal for district policy to dictate the available placements for a student, and it's illegal for the available placements to dictate the least restrictive environment for the student. It is an IEP team decision. Whatever this kid needs, the IEP team is empowered to make that placement decision. And both advocates and districts, with their varying motivations, are now pushing for 100% inclusion. And parents and teachers are both clear that that is not right for every student.
Well, it's not right, and it's not. It's not behooving to everybody in the situation. Those that have the special ed, requirements, and those that are in the classroom that are unable to learn because of. And again, we are talking about a very, very small percentage. I think inclusion is a wonderful idea, but it can't be 100%. And if that is your goal, then I think you're going to hurt both sides. So I completely agree with that. I had wrote down something from one of the videos of just the fear of exclusion to the detriment of those following the rules, right? I mean, it's the idea that those that are following the rules, because consequences now, for whatever reason, I'm not sure when that became a passe idea to have consequences for your action, but it definitely seems like that is specifically in the way that a lot of schools are handling discipline. But everybody is suffering from that. It's sad.
Yeah, and I think those are separate issues, but they interact in many schools, because you have students who are placed inappropriately in environments that are too stimulating for them, where they really just need to be in a smaller classroom. But then you have other students who don't have the same needs, but who see what happens to that student who exhibits those behaviors and say, hey, I want some of that. If this other child who has, legitimate needs is getting, lots of time out of class, lots of rewards, maybe gets to be on electronics when nobody else does, gets breaks and snacks that nobody else does. I think we're also seeing an epidemic of copycat behavior, where kids rationally realize, hey, I don't actually have to do what the adults tell me. And in fact, the worse I behave, the more privileges I get. The better things get for me, the more I act up. And again, that's not the motivation behind what's going on with the original student. That student is just inappropriately placed. But when we remove consequences and supply all kinds of rewards for, what for everybody else is simply bad behavior, then of course we're going to see a lot more of it. Right.
And I mean, you had mentioned before of just the idea of, looking at it through the eyes of, as a parent, would you do that same thing? Absolutely not. And I think that's, my wife and I always talk about our goal as parents is to help our boys be productive, wonderful citizens of the country, right? They can do whatever it is they need to do, but they need to be productive citizens that are giving back and not being a detriment to society. And I feel like there's a lot of parents that maybe lose sight of that a little bit, of they're either so intent on holding on to them and not letting their babies grow up, or they're wanting to have them live in this bubble where there are no consequences. You can do and act exactly the way you want, you can be what you want, and I mean, it just seems a little bit like there's just a disconnect from reality of how the world works with how some people are raising their kids, because to my knowledge, that's not how the world works. I mean, there are consequences. You talked, and again, I'm jumping ahead, but the idea of grading of like the behaviors of actually turning in your work and actually doing the work that you're supposed to, that is still a requirement in the real world. And if we remove that as an expectation education, what are we doing to set them up for success in the future?
Yeah, and I think it gets back to the direction that we're looking when we look at a student who maybe is not doing well. Are we looking at them as a baby who needs support and accommodation? And, you can't get a baby to do what you want by yelling. Certainly, you have to recognize the developmental limitations of a baby. But I think when we're looking at school age students, we have to look forward to them as adults and think, what is going to serve, knowing that they're not a baby now and they're not going to be a baby ever again, how can we best serve them to be successful as adults? So yeah, that forward-looking perspective, I think, is critical.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So one of the second idea that you mentioned that we need to, take again more of a scientific approach to reform is special education. We've kind of already talked about the 100% inclusion in every situation is not feasible, is not helpful for everybody. That is an IEP team decision. I love that. It makes a lot of sense. You mentioned least restrictive environment. I guess, many of the people that are going to be watching this podcast are going to know that term, right? So their education mind, like, oh yeah, least restrictive environment. So I guess in your mind, what does that look like for those, 1-2% of kiddos that it doesn't make sense that they are in a general classroom all of the time?
Yeah. Well, I think the origin of that term comes from the history of special education, where for many years, students who had more profound needs either were not allowed to attend public schools at all, or they were required to attend specific programs that were based on their disability category. Like if you had Down syndrome, you had to go to the Down syndrome school. And obviously, that's not a meaningful category for, deciding the best environment for any individual student. So, I think the term refers to an individualized need and a right, really, to be in an environment that is as unrestrictive as possible, right? That is as close to what everybody else gets as possible. And being in a separate school entirely would be not a very good example of that. That's a bit more restrictive. But I think the big irony right now is that, like, I remember as a principal, the rule of thumb was having a one-on-one aide, having an adult with you constantly at school to watch over you, to keep you safe, to keep other people safe, to keep you on track. That was considered the most restrictive placement. And, I think part of the reason we call that the most restrictive placement is because it's also the most expensive placement. So I think there's a little bit of financial incentive speaking there.
Exactly.
But I think it's also correct that having one adult hover over you all day long is fairly invasive. It's fairly restrictive. And we only want to do that if we need to.
Sure.
And what we're seeing now is that because there's this 100% inclusion ideology, we're seeing tons and tons of kids get placed with one-on-one aides in classrooms where they cannot be successful, even with that support, even with two-on-one support in some cases. And we're seeing the dismantling of programs where, historically you'd have 6 or 8 students, 2 or 3 adults, and it's just a calmer, less stimulating environment, more support, more opportunity to structure the day in ways that work for the students. That would be a less restrictive environment for a lot of students than the one-on-one that they're placed with in a quote unquote fully inclusive setting. So I just think we have to go back and look at what those terms meant before we were doing the things we're doing now, because I think we're going wrong on some of those.
Yeah, I completely agree.
And now, a brief commercial from today's sponsor.
Hey guys, Andy Bennett, the host of the Empowered Learning Podcast and also the owner and president of Interactive Learning. Interactive Learning has been around for close to 20 years, and we exist to empower the future of education. We do that through engaging technologies and leadership programs, and coupled and partnered with our amazing team out in Utah with Ward's Media Tech, we have put together just an amazing set of educational technology and leadership programs. We carry lots of different things, everything from display technologies, digital signage, an amazing brand new school safety platform, phenomenal, STEM, VR, AR platforms and solutions, device charging, which is always necessary in schools, our one-of-a-kind leadership programs, active learning, career exploration that allows students to be exposed to lots of different career paths and instructional technologies, and so much more. We add new things literally every week. So that's a little overwhelming, and I get it as a former teacher and administrator. So what we've created is a class tech discovery session. So in a quick matter of time, to be respectful of your time, what we do is we go from a sea of choices, all of the technology out there, and we whittle that down to a cove of solutions that makes the most sense to you. I would love to schedule a class tech discovery session with you or someone on your staff to determine if there's anything we can do to partner and work with you. So if you're interested in scheduling and finding out more about the class tech discovery session, you can reach out to me on my cell phone. You can book a time with me directly right here, or if you prefer, you can reach out to me at andy@intlrn.com. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and enjoy the podcast.
And now, back to the Empowered Learning Podcast.
You mentioned in another one of your videos of just the idea of just back to kind of the teacher safety aspect of things. And, if we can't afford to have a certified teacher as a one-on-one, then let's throw a para at them. And again, you mentioned you would hate to think, but the reality is that this is the case, is that there are financial factors that come into staffing of this, right? I mean, it would be great if they had every special ed teacher or special ed whatever had a master's degree and was specific in that. There's this shortage of teachers anyway, so it's what is the cheapest way to get the kid the services that they need. And then unfortunately, if they're not, to your point, in the least restrictive environment, but in a setting where they can thrive and do their best, then there's going to be acting out, which then might cause those paras to leave, which again, there's another whole issue there of what is going on with the exodus of teachers, and then how can we change that dynamic. But any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and definitely I hear a lot from paras, because there are so many paras, there's so much turnover in that position,
Right.
and people frequently report feeling like punching bags in those roles. That my job is basically to get kicked so nobody else does. And I don't know who would want that job. Certainly if you put that on the job posting, nobody would apply. But that's the reality for many people. And I've heard from I started taking screenshots and keeping track last year, and I eventually gave up, of all the people who specifically said that they had to have surgery, like knee surgery, back surgery, neck surgery, shoulder surgery, because of injuries from students.
Yeah.
And I thought, if I've got, I got into the dozens before I stopped counting. And I thought, this is not a small problem, and it's not getting better as long as we are continuing to basically just throw warm bodies at inappropriately placed students and hope for the best. Certainly if this were, I was also shocked to discover that schools are not actually regulated by OSHA. If you were operating some sort of manufacturing company and people got hurt all the time, OSHA would knock on your door and say, what are you guys doing? And they would probably fine you and put lots of rules in place. Well, public schools, shockingly, in the United States are not regulated by OSHA. So we apparently have this unlimited ability to hire people and put them in harm's way and just not really do anything about it. Just not have any solution other than that person gets hurt and often has to pay for their own medical treatment. So
that's terrible. That actually kind of leads into another one that you had mentioned and it was very interesting. It was very interesting catch. The beginning of the video was like the right to refuse educational services when safety is a factor. That's not something that I think. I'm sure that's not something that teachers are being taught in schools, right? So unless they're doing some own research or unfortunately getting in those positions where they have to actually say, and I think the wording that you said was, I'm not willing to create the legal, educational, or ethical liability that it would create to have this student back in my classroom. So the idea of for many reasons, not just because I'm not a team player, it's not right for them, it's not right for me, it's not right for my students. We are going to, and you mentioned in the video that doesn't necessarily get the district off the hook, but for that teacher, when they've had this happen over and over and over and over again, and they're getting, like you said, they're just a punching bag, it's okay to stand up and say, this is not the right place for them. And there are, lots of liabilities happening because of this. District, do better. Let's find a better spot for this.
Yeah, and I think the placement of responsibility is really key here because teachers are often made to feel like they are personally responsible for fulfilling all of the district's legal responsibilities,
Right.
right? But those are district level responsibilities. There's no
Yep.
law that says that you, as the individual teacher, have to meet all of this child's needs. If a child is inappropriately placed, they're not safe, they're throwing furniture, they're hurting
Right.
other people. Like, yeah, I do think we have the right and the responsibility to stand up and say, like, I'm not going to go to that room and watch this kind of thing continue to happen. It is
Right.
just not safe.
Right.
And like honestly, that was something I never heard anybody say in the 10 years I was in Seattle Public Schools. Nobody ever said, I refuse to work with that kid. It just
Right.
didn't come up because honestly, it didn't need to.
Yeah.
If we had a situation that was unsafe, that was going to be recognized
Right.
at all levels of leadership, and steps were going to be taken to make that situation safe. And I see just so many people now stuck in situations where people are not watching out for their safety, and they're told to basically just suck it up and deal with it.
Right.
And that doesn't work.
No, it does not. It does not. And I know that we've already talked about discipline reform, but the idea of progressive discipline, you talk about that a lot. And again, I'm not sure at what point we decided that was a bad idea, but it does seem like you said, 10 years ago, this was not an issue, not overnight, but I mean, it is gradually become an issue where teacher safety and the idea of like, if you have repeat offenders or this is, progressively getting worse and worse, there needs to be more consequences, more serious consequences, not rewarding the behavior and hoping that it gets better. I don't understand it doesn't make logical sense for them to expect that to work. Yet here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is traceable directly back to the Dear Colleague letter about disproportionality. And again, it's good to be worried about disproportionality, but we should not have any kind of magical thinking that says, you can tweak the statistics and change the underlying reality. Like you can't just stop suspending or stop reporting suspensions and expect the problem to go away. And one of the things I realized as I got into a lot of the data and the research about discipline is that we don't actually have good data on behavior. We only have data on consequences. If you wanted to do research on school discipline, you would have almost no data to work with on behavior itself. And if as a school system, you want to demonstrate that you're treating students fairly, that you're applying consequences fairly, that you're not giving consequences when you don't need to, that you're not being too harsh, that you're not worsening disproportionality, you actually have to be able to demonstrate the relationship between behavior and consequences. And yet there's no widespread data collection on behavior itself. So researchers do all these bizarre things to infer what the behavior must have been based on what the consequences were, because schools do have to report suspensions and expulsions and things like that. But the data is just not there. So they're making up essentially assumptions about what the behavior is like in any given school. And if you don't know that, it's very difficult to judge the actions of administrators as being fair or not fair.
Sure.
And if you have a lot of behavior, you're probably going to have a lot of consequences. And we're holding people accountable for having a lot of consequences. So they are rationally responding by backing off on consequences. And then, of course, behavior is getting worse as a result.
Right. Wow. Yikes. That's a sad state of affairs. That's crazy. I'm not sure where to go from that one. So we'll put a pin in that one. When you figure out the magic wand for that that issue, let us know. Let's dive into another one that you talk about a lot is grading reform and how standards-based grading at its initial appearance makes a lot of sense. However, again, maybe to this idea of liking an idea and rather than testing its effectiveness, just jumping in both feet and not really thinking through all of the ramifications of throwing out what used to be working to dive into this new idea. Give me some thoughts on where we're at right now with grading reform, the good, the bad, and where we need to find that balance.
Yeah. So I think, grading has a long and pretty well-established history. I just read a paper by Tom Guskey the other day that goes into some of the history of grading. And, it's kind of what you would think, that grading has been pretty traditional, for most of the existence of public schools in America.
Right.
But there have been, for decades, experiments with standards-based grading and various grading reforms. And I think this is a case of, having some good ideas, but then leaping, how like strawberries send out runners, to kind of leap over plant some roots nearby. I think what's happened with standards-based grading is like we knew that standards-based planning and curriculum and assessment and teaching were good, right? I would argue forcefully that standards-based teaching is good,
right.
But it does not necessarily follow that giving a report card to parents that reports on standards, that doesn't use traditional grades, that doesn't have any kind of accountability for behavior and effort and things like that baked
Right.
in the way traditional grades do.
Right.
That shift, or that kind of runner away from standards-based teaching,
Mhm.
is a lot less well established than than people would like us to think. So I think one of the big things that's going wrong with standards-based grading is the removal of accountability. And what standards-based grading advocates will often say is, well, we're not removing accountability. We're simply reporting things like behavior, timeliness, attention to detail separately from mastery of standards.
Right.
And like, if you had said that to me 10 years ago, I would have said, that sounds good. It sounds more detailed. It sounds more granular.
Right.
But I'm realizing today that what goes wrong there in that breakdown from just one grade, you have an 89 in this class, and that represents your effort, your mastery, turning in your work, passing your tests, things like that. When we break that down, we're breaking down accountability for the reason that you can't have multiple accountabilities, right? If I get a 52 in a class, the accountability for that is that I don't pass. If I'm a high school student, I don't get credit.
Sure.
If I break down that accountability into academic mastery and then timeliness and behavior and
Sure.
Neatness and things like that, well, I can't use all of those for accountability. Like, am I going to fail if my handwriting is too messy? Am I going to fail if my work is late? Like, we can't, unless we're talking about making students pass in all of those areas, I think it becomes kind of unviable for accountability. And that was just not anticipated by standards-based grading advocates at all.
Right. Right. I completely agree. Yeah. I mean, and that was another one that you'd mentioned of just the idea of including behavior, and they'll some people will propose that, well, that's a separate issue, and I think you kind of we have to lump them together. I mean, that's, again, I'm kind of a pragmatic person when it comes to this kind of stuff of, like, in the real world, your boss is not going to say, hey, I'm gonna, I would give you a raise for this, but not for that. It's like it's a cumulative effort, right? Your cumulative effort in this includes how well you're doing on this. Yes, your progression, right? I mean, if you have students that are starting from further behind, but they're making massive gains, then let's identify that, let's reward that, and let's see that for what that is. And then the opposite extreme is, if you come in knowing all of the standards, but you're not doing your work, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's got to be a balance between the two. And I think the learning behavior is a skill that they need moving forward. I would even argue maybe even more than the actual content of the class. Right? I mean, because that's going to serve you even if you're not in an like an English styled job. If I know how to turn in things, how to be responsible, I mean, that's going to serve me in life more than the content might.
Absolutely. And I'm sure all of us learned lots of things in high school that we've forgotten, right? Like, I probably couldn't do a lot of what I learned in algebra 2.
Right.
But the habits of finishing work, of working with my group, of not being too inconsiderate of others, there are lots of things that we take with us, even if we don't remember the content that hopefully we mastered at some point.
Sure.
And I think, back to what we want for our own kids, I don't want my kids to get great grades on mastery, but then fail at everything else, because I think that doesn't bode well for their success in life. And again, they're going to be adults. They're not just people who have mastered standards or not. They're going to be adults who have to live full lives and get along with other people.
Right. So one more thing on the grading thing, of this idea of grading inflation. I think you'd mentioned on one of your videos, that it's common practice that everybody's getting an A at this point. And then that, again, that's not serving kids as well. It makes the ones that actually work their tail off to get that A not really want to work, and the ones that are, it's that doesn't seem to be serving as well. So what are your thoughts on grade inflation? What do we need to do to kind of address that and kind of get back to that balanced point?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to recognize that there are multiple pieces of information and multiple data sources that do different jobs, right? If we want to really know about mastery of the standards, we can use standardized tests. I mean, we're not going to do better than standardized tests for truly assessing mastery in an objective way that's not subject to any kind of inflation or bias on the part of the teacher. Standardized tests are the best we could ever possibly hope to do. And the other aspects of education do different jobs, right? Like, so teacher grades do reflect effort. They do reflect citizenship to some extent, participation, and lots of things other than mastery. And I think that's a good thing. That's a value add to have that information. And if we want even more granular information, we have assignments. I think it's important for teachers to grade and hand back assignments. So if the parent wants to see, what does my kid not understand in their Algebra 2 class, they can look at the actual test that they got back or the homework that they got back and say, okay, this is where they need to do some additional studying. So, I mean, we have that information available, and we just need to make sure that we're not reorganizing it in such a way that it breaks down the accountability. I think that's the biggest thing. Is we have to recognize the jobs that traditional grading is doing, and if we're going to change anything about traditional grading, make sure all of those jobs still get done.
Right. You mentioned, and it might have been if somebody was just kind of listening to this and they're walking and doing their thing, and you mentioned something about standardized testing that might have stopped them in their tracks. Tell me more about your thoughts on standardized testing as a good tool for what it is intended for, maybe not a stick that everybody should be beaten with, but what are some pros for standardized testing? I guess specifically about, I watched the video on colleges now reintroducing that as a metric, because that is an even playing field for everyone to get into. Give me your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think one reason we don't like standardized testing very much is because we can't do all that much to affect standardized test scores. It's very frustrating to us as educators. And, I was really hopeful that our standardized tests would shift to become more content focused so that they test what we're actually teaching. And that doesn't seem to be the case nationally. Like we're mostly still doing standardized testing the way we always have. And that means the distribution of scores is largely fixed and largely dependent on socioeconomics and other things that are outside of our control. So, I think standardized tests certainly still are the best way to measure anything objectively, or another way of saying that is standardized tests are the worst way to measure, except for all the alternatives, right? It's kind of like capitalism. It's the worst economic system except for all the alternatives. And, like if we had something better, I would say let's use it, but there's no evidence that we do have something better. Teacher grades are certainly more subjective, and, the more effort is put into making good test items, the better a job a standardized test can do of assessing whatever it is that we're trying to assess. And certainly that's a whole professional specialty. I've only had a little bit of a window and a little bit of training in that world. But, I think a lot of the bad taste we have in our mouths as educators when it comes to standardized testing is because of No Child Left Behind, right? 25 years ago, we were told you have to get all students basically above average. All students have to be above average. And it wasn't worded that way, but if you look at how the tests were constructed, that was the implication, is that all students not need to meet standard, not need to learn a certain body of information, but need to be above average. And of course, that's impossible. So
exactly. Yep.
The accountability pressure just did not work and couldn't work.
No, it's not realistic. In the idea of the getting back to standardized testing as a metric, not the only one, but you had mentioned in one of your videos that we want to have education be a driver of equity in our society, whereas a lot of times things are maybe disproportionately helpful for ones that have money, right? I mean, it's easier for kids to have money because they can game certain systems. With standardized testing, that does level the playing field. You can have a brilliant student that maybe doesn't have the economic advantages that some other people do, that if that is now reintroduced as part of this, you can let the cream rise to the top, as it should.
Yeah, I think I saw a lot of people commented on that video about the SAT, and there are some New York Times articles about the SAT being reintroduced at some colleges that had dropped it. And a lot of people said in the comments, I would not have gotten the scholarships I did if it hadn't been for the SAT or the ACT, because, they saw something in me that my teachers didn't necessarily, that I didn't see in myself, that my parents didn't see in me, but the SAT or ACT recognized that, and I got college scholarships, and here I am. And I think that's a little bit of a different goal than we're usually working on in K-12. We're not so much focused on helping our highest achieving students get into the best possible college or get the most possible scholarships. That's not our aim all the way through. We do care about everyone and about helping everyone, achieve to the best of their ability. So it's a little bit of a tricky issue to think about, because really things like that are not necessarily drivers of equity. They are in a way, drivers of inequality because they're recognizing people with exceptional academic abilities and then giving those people further opportunity.
Right.
So I think we've also got to keep in mind, what do we do for all students? Like, what knowledge do we want all students to end up with, even if they don't go to college, even if they don't get scholarships, even if they don't score the highest on standardized tests? And I think knowledge itself is where we should be redirecting a lot of our efforts in K-12 instead of all the other things we're doing.
Right, right. You had another video that was talking about, I think the title was like knowledge is obsolete. And this idea of, because we have, Google in our pocket and Chat GPT, why would I need to know, quote unquote, anything? Because I can just look it up. And like, I agree with you. I think you said knowledge sticks to knowledge, right? If you have this idea where you have a good body of knowledge, things are going to come not necessarily easier to you, but you have practiced how you acquire knowledge and how you apply knowledge, and that just that widens your skill set in a variety of ways, even if it's not in that specific thing. So I completely agree with that. Yep. One other, so of the four that you'd mentioned in the last video, SEL, which I was very interested in, because that seems like at surface level, like, why would we not want to, apply social emotional learning? And why would that not be a focus or a component of education at this point? And you had a really interesting point, the Band-Aids, if you remember that analogy right there. Tell us a little bit about why SEL is good, but it may not be something that is universally acceptable, or not even acceptable, universally needed.
Yeah, so this is a brand new argument to me, but I'm listening to Abigail Schreier's book called Bad Therapy, and her argument in that book is that SEL is basically taking a light version of what should be professional psychiatric or psychological or counseling help, and we're trying to kind of do a light version of that in the classroom, and we shouldn't expect that is without any negative consequences. Just as, we would never think that it's our job to provide medication or do surgery on students. But at the same time, why are we okay with sticking Band-Aids all over everybody, right? Like, if you have a kid who gets injured and needs a Band-Aid, and we're making the physical injury a metaphor for any kind of mental health or social emotional issue. If you would give a kid a Band-Aid when they need one, why wouldn't you give a kid a Band-Aid in a kind of preventative way, or in a way that kind of additionally protects them, right? Like, if you cover yourself in Band-Aids that you don't need, you're slightly more protected, right? But you're probably going to get some sort of rash or psoriasis or an infection just from having all those Band-Aids stuck all over your body all the time. So the concept there that I think that is at the heart of these concerns is iatrogenesis, that by talking about feelings, talking about mental health. One thing she talks about in the book quite a bit is all the surveys that are given to students. And I have not seen these surveys personally. Typically, adults don't look at them. But, if we're constantly asking students, how do you feel? Are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about an eating, do you have an eating disorder? Like, it does seem plausible to me that if we're constantly putting these things on kids' minds, that would potentially have negative effects, just as we saw with the DARE program. I think the DARE program is like one of the biggest embarrassments that we've ever had in education and in child wellness policy. The idea that we should try to warn kids against drugs. Well, it turns out the DARE program just made kids excited about drugs. It increased the likelihood that they would use drugs, and I think we've got to not forget that lesson. We're doing something different here, obviously, but we need to really keep that lesson in mind, because it's a sobering one.
Right, for sure. Yeah, and I would imagine that probably in a similar vein. Like, I feel like we have my family has a good set of morals and this kind of stuff. Like, I don't need education to be pumping them full of ideas of negative things that they need to avoid. They're already avoiding those. Why do we need to bring that up? And it's that idea of out of sight, out of mind. But now it's in my mind, so let's start Googling that. Let's find out more about that. It's unnecessary and not helpful for everybody, right? This idea that everybody needs the same amount of information and the same instruction is just not necessary. So I agree. Let's see here. Where shall we go here? Let's talk a little bit about the state of education and teachers, and just I've said mass exodus. I'm not sure you would agree with that. It just seems like that anywhere you look, there are postings for job education, but even paras. I think paras is even another thing because of the pay. What can be done about that? I mean, we dove right into the deep end. We didn't even talk about the Principal Center, which you are the I don't know if the founder of, but the director of that organization. So I'm sure you have ideas. You've talked about all of these big questions. What can be done about the mass exodus of teachers from education right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like we have enough people who are interested in being educators in general, right? Like I think we've always had a pretty good appeal to enough people that education is viable, that we can staff it, we can attract people to the profession. I think the problems are they're leaks in the bucket, right? It's not that this is not a viable profession. It is that with the conditions, like I've seen the quote many times. I'm sure you've seen this too. It's not that we have a teacher shortage. It's that we have a shortage of people who are willing to work for this pay under these conditions. And the reality is lots of other jobs are easier. Lots of other jobs are physically safer. Lots of other jobs pay better. And people are always going to act somewhat rationally in making that kind of decision. And people will even be a little bit irrational in sticking with teaching, even if it's not the best thing for them. They love it. And we need to not take that for granted. But we have to not make people just a terrible offer and wonder why they're not taking it. Like if it just doesn't pay well, if it's unsafe, if it's stressful, then obviously people are going to seek jobs that are more flexible, less stressful, and more remunerative.
Right. Well, and then you add on top of that the fact that higher education is more expensive now than it ever has been. So, why would I get a teaching degree knowing that it's going to take me 15, 20 years to pay this back and not be, appreciated and be possibly in unsafe environments? And I really don't want listeners to think that we are bashing education to your point, that there's always been people that see this as a calling, see this as something that, hey, since I had this second grade teacher that just touched my heart and life. And I've known since that moment that I want to do the same thing for kids. And we need to do better about allowing those teachers that have that passion to be able to stay, because as somebody that was in education and for a variety of reasons got out, I don't want to lose more good teachers because of those factors that seem to be things that we can at least affect a positive change on.
Yeah, absolutely. And my wife and I are both second generation educators, but as I've talked with other educators who are in a similar position, and maybe have adult children who've gone into education and then left education, it has just been really sobering to see what has changed, and to see that we have to make the conditions better rationally if we want people to stay. We can't just have this kind of magical thinking that there's this workforce out there that is looking forward to being injured and underpaid and make that their career. That's just not going to be the reality.
No, it's not. So I want to, I do have the 3 key questions that we always ask our Empowered Learning podcast guests. But before we do that, like I said, we kind of dove right into the deep end of specifics from some of your videos. But tell us about the Principal Center. Why was it founded? What do you guys do? What is the mission and the vision of that specific organization? And then we'll kind of tie that with what is a good leader in education now.
Yeah, so our mission at the Principal Center is to build capacity for instructional leadership, and it is my mission specifically to help school administrators get into classrooms every day, have feedback conversations that change teacher practice, and discover their best opportunities for school improvement. So we have a lot on the classroom walkthrough and teacher evaluation side. We have programs and software and things for that. We also have a free podcast. We've done over 400 episodes now, and each episode focuses on a book. So if you're looking to keep up with the new books that come out and decide which of them to buy and read yourself, Principal Center Radio is a great way to do that. And I really enjoy getting to speak with leading authors and help put their work out there for public consideration. And that's just a lot of fun. Principal Center Radio, and that's a great place for people to engage.
Love it. Yeah, definitely check that out. Book Centered. Perfect. Yeah. Awesome. So I guess along that line, because like you said, you're trying to empower. I don't know if that was the word you used, but I think that's probably a good segue, right? Educational leaders to build capacity, right? Build capacity for instructional leadership. So being that we have all of the challenges, shall we say, right? We're going to keep this on a got to get the L in there. The challenges in education that we see right now. What makes a good leader in education right now? That's a very broad question, but if you could put put a couple bullet points on that. What makes a good leader in education right now?
Yeah, I think listening to teachers is probably the main thing, and taking people seriously when they have concerns, and not seeing those concerns just as excuses, but really taking them seriously as things that we need, conditions that we need to ensure for people to succeed, right? And I think that was always kind of my goal as a leader, was to be mostly irrelevant and to let people have what they need to succeed. If I could disappear tomorrow and everything could carry on without me, that's success to me as a leader.
Right.
But if I'm letting things get unsustainable for teachers, if I'm having teachers leave because they don't have what they need, then I'm going to have a lot more work for myself to do, and we're not going to be getting our students what they need. So yeah, building capacity is a great way to put it.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Well, Justin, thank you so much for joining us today. I really, really appreciate it. In the messages back and forth leading up to this, I was humbled by your just response of giving my little upstart podcast here a chance. So I appreciate the time, and it's been wonderful. I would like to kind of close with a few key questions that we always ask our guests. So question number one: who is the leader that you most admire and try to emulate?
I would have to give some credit to one of my last supervisors as a principal. So I will call out Phil Brockman, who was one of my directors when I was a principal, and I believe he is a superintendent in Washington State now. But Phil was just a fantastic listener, a fantastic leader, and a fantastic capacity builder. And for him, it was always about, how can I support you in succeeding? I think if we want people to succeed, we will support them toward that end. And that was just so important for me as a new principal.
A couple things that you mentioned before, and then that just kind of reiterates this right there, is the idea that as leaders, if you're doing your job well, you step away, it continues to go on. I mean, the idea of like basically working yourself out of a job is what the best leaders do, right? They can carry on the good work that you've started. And I love that. I think the thing that probably gets in the way the most for leaders doing that or not doing that is ego. So making it not about yourself, making it about what is best for them. How can you build capacity for that leader and that upcoming leader, but also for education in the future? Get over yourself, to do what you can to help them be their best self. I love it.
Very well said.
All right. Question number two, sir. What learning? Sounds like you are constantly reading new books and doing this kind of stuff. So over the last year, we're still towards the beginning of 2024. So looking back over the last year, what learning has most impacted you?
Yeah, it's hard to pin down a time frame. I want to give credit to a book that I'm sure I read, several years ago now, but Natalie Wexler's The Knowledge Gap.
Okay.
I think that book has really helped me understand what's going on with some of these pendulum swings and understand how learning works in a way that, maybe was always there, but wasn't made explicit in the same way. Just a tremendous book that has informed a lot of the, the reading instruction debates, the curriculum debates, and then also just key questions about how we teach and how students learn. That is a book that I think just everybody needs to read.
Okay, love it. I'll check it out. Appreciate it. All right, last question for you, sir. That you said that you had to go pick up the kiddos here. I want to make sure that I'm respectful of your time. Last question, per the title of the podcast: how would you empower learning for the future generations?
I think sustainability is something that's on my mind a lot, that we really need to set things up in such a way that we're not just hoping that it works out, that we're actually creating the kinds of careers that people want to stay in long term, that we're making classroom environments safe so that people want to send their kids and want to show up to work every day. I think that is the best path for public education to thrive for future generations.
So safe spaces, future applications of what it is that we're teaching and working on towards that. So good stuff. Well, Justin, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been fantastic. I love the videos. I'm sure I will learn something new every time that I check it out. So for those that don't, I will put that in the show notes as well for the Principal Center Radio, for the organization itself, and then all of his TikTok channels and that kind of stuff. So thank you very much for your time, Justin. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, Andy. Great to speak with you.
Take care. Bye.
Take care.